Hi everyone! Today I want to talk to you about historical sources. Historical sources are the documents, objects, images, and recordings that historians and other people studying history use to learn about what happened in the past. There are three kinds of historical sources that people use, and each of them is important and useful as long as they're used correctly. So I want to talk to you about those three kinds of sources today. Those sources are primary sources, secondary sources, and tertiary sources. The first kind of historical source is the most important. These are called primary sources. The word primary means earliest or most important. So primary sources are going to be the documents and objects that are the earliest and most important sources when we should be looking at when studying a historical event or time. You've probably heard the word primary before when it's talking about colors, right? The primary colors are red, yellow, and blue. Depending who you're talking to, you also have white and black. Now, if you have those primary colors, you can make all the other colors in the rainbow because they mix together. The same thing goes with primary source documents. If you're studying an event and you don't have any of the other sources, but you do have primary sources, you can figure out what happened pretty easily and know that you're going to be relatively accurate. So, the primary sources are documents that were created by people who were actually there during the event or time. The best primary sources are usually created during or soon after the event. Examples of primary sources are journals, letters, newspaper articles, songs, physical objects like vases, pots, or tools, photographs, paintings, videos, voice recordings, and many, many others. In fact, depending on the question you're asking, almost anything can be a primary source. Here's an example. When I was in college, I took a class called The History of the Jews. I decided to write a paper on how non-Jewish people viewed Jews during the Victorian era. The main sources that I used were novels, like Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott, and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. Because my question was, how did Victorian authors portray or tell the story of Jews in their society, these novels were primary sources for me. If I had been asking a question about how Jews saw themselves in Victorian England, those novels would not have been good primary sources. So, as you can see, primary sources can be almost anything as long as you're asking the right question. The most important thing to remember when deciding if something is a primary source is to ask, was this created by someone from the time I'm trying to learn about? If the answer is yes, then it is probably a primary source. For your own information and interest, I'm going to include links to some great websites for exploring different primary sources in the video description. The second kind of historical source is called a secondary source. Imagine that! Secondary sources are documents created by people who were not at an event or alive during a time period, but they are based on primary sources. For example, a documentary about World War II is a secondary source because it's written, edited, and created by people who were not actually there during World War II. However, it does use the words, images, and videos of people who were there. That's what makes a great secondary source. Secondary sources include historical books, not textbooks, but historical books, journal articles, magazine articles, documentaries, websites, podcasts, and many more. Most of the historical sources you run into outside of an archive or library are secondary sources. They're helpful for learning about topics and understanding what historians have already written and learned about something. However, if you're doing your own research and writing your own paper, it's always a good idea to go back and look at the primary sources for yourself. It's always important to make sure that any secondary source you look at is trustworthy. But we'll talk about trustworthy sources in another video. The final type of historical source is called a tertiary source. These are things like textbooks and encyclopedias. The point of a tertiary source is to use primary and secondary sources to create a brief or short overview of events that is easy for people to look at and reference and get information from. Wikipedia is a great example of a tertiary source. So are any history textbook that you've used at school. These are great places to get started if you are interested in learning about something. But because they are meant to be short, they often miss some of the best details and make history so much fun to learn. For your journal activity today, I want you to find a picture. Remember, pictures are primary sources of a historical event, any event you want. You can either print it out and glue it into your journal, or you can draw your own version. Then write a short paragraph about why you like this picture and what it means to you. Why don't you help future historians understand what people in 2020 thought about their own past? Have a great day. Stay out of trouble. Make good choices.